drought-affected communities, with children and youth, yourselves, and what we're going to be doing with labor soon, and environmental and social justice organizations, we really want to bring through in the conversation this idea of climate justice, and to anchor the conversation around climate justice as the basis to tackle the climate problem. So, most of you sitting in the room appreciate, I assume, the science. And the science on climate change is very stark and it's very clear, and we have to keep it front and center in our politics and in our conversation. So basically, since the Industrial Revolution, the science has confirmed that we have a 1-degree increase in planetary temperature. We also know from various scientific perspectives that people like Michael Mann, we have what is called the hockey curve. Since the 1950s, we've seen this intense acceleration of carbon at the level of use in life, whether it's industrialization in some countries, whether it's industrialized food regimes, etc. And so this great acceleration since the 1950s has also, if you like, brought to the fore increasing carbon use, okay? And carbon emissions are going up despite 20 years or more of climate negotiations, climate science, etc. Now, as I present this short talk to you, I'm also going to be critical of not the science per se, but the discourse around, the official discourse around climate change coming from the UN, etc. So, one of the explanations for the problem, if you read UN documents, there's two very important documents of late. There's the 2018 1.5 degrees Celsius report. It's the report that has raised the alarm bell the loudest over the past 2 decades around where we are. But if you read that document, it also is embedded with this idea of human beings, particularly population, as a problem. If you read the recent IPCC panel on biodiversity report, it also alludes to population as a problem. So yes, we had 7.7 billion, and in coming decades we'll be probably at about 9.7 billion. But from a climate justice perspective, this is not an adequate explanation for the problem. Actually, in our view as climate justice activists, this is a red herring. It also takes us into a place where it's the darker nations that have to be blamed for this problem. So if Africa has high fertility rates, it has a population explosion, well, Africa is to blame for climate change. Now that is absolutely false. Okay? If you historicize this problem and we look and locate it, we can see where the problem comes from over 150 years, the industrialized countries. We can see the inequalities in resource use. If an average American's way of life is reproduced on planet Earth, we'll need 5 planets. Okay? If the average European's way of life is reproduced on planet Earth, we'll need 2.5 planets. Okay? So it's not the darker nations, it's not population that's the problem. There's a serious inequality problem around resource use and so on planet Earth. So scientists talk about us being in this very, if you like, dangerous place. The last time we've had such carbon concentration in our atmosphere was 3 million years ago, and at that point in time, Earth was hot, okay? And so the people that are grappling with the science are trying to think with this analogy for the present, okay? So given that carbon emissions are going up, it can be correlated to this historical analogy. What's happening? Okay, how long is it going to take for runaway global warming and things like that? And that's kind of where the debate is in the science. When are tipping points going to kick in? So, the first official narrative on climate change that has come out of the International Panel on Climate Change acknowledges historical climate change. You've had these cycles, etc. You've had ice ages and so on. But at the same time is recognizing that human beings are a geological force and that they are impacting on the parameters of our planet. The 1 degree increase in planetary temperature circa 2015 has basically inaugurated a new world, and I'll talk about that just now. Most of us living on planet Earth, present generations, don't appreciate that with a 1 degree increase in planetary temperature, our world has changed fundamentally. Fundamentally. Okay. The other point to make is that, and I've been saying this, is that it's not adequate. And I'm a social scientist, and I come at the science not as a physicist and not as a climatologist, but as a social scientist, and I read it and I teach it to my students, and I engage on it through my activism. Population is not the explanation for climate change. Okay? So you have the physics of climate change, which helps us understand causality at the level of the chemistry and what's going on in our climate. But at the level of socio-ecological explanation, we need a deeper perspective. And that's where climate justice offers us another way to think about this problem. We also know that we are a force that's changing planet Earth, but it's not all of us. It's not, the average African is not responsible for the climate problem. The carbon footprint of the average African on this continent is really way lower than the average American, for example. Okay? You cannot apportion blame in that kind of way. That is injustice. Okay? And I'll come back to that just now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the second narrative that I want to contest a little bit from a climate justice perspective. So if you look at the history of planet Earth, it's about 4.5 billion years old. And the climate scientists that I've been interviewing, and I was in Europe recently and learning from them and so on, characterize this history as follows. They say planet Earth, world 1, if you like, was prior to the Holocene period, which was 11,000 years ago. And Earth 1, if you like, was really a chaotic world. There were major swings and changes in climate on planet Earth. Ice ages, heating moments, etc. You had an unstable climate on planet Earth prior to 11,000 years ago. So that was world 1. 11,000 years ago, planetary conditions changed and we entered a period in geological time and history called the Holocene. And the Holocene has existed for 11,000 years, enabling us to have settled communities, civilizations grew up, sophisticated cultures, writing, science, mathematics, etc. And over 11,000 years till 1950, we had a relatively stable climate that enabled human life to flourish, to grow, to explore its talents, its possibilities, etc. But given that, if you like, we have also polluted planet Earth, and particularly our carbon corporations, there is a third world that is now beginning to emerge. The geologists refer to it as the Anthropocene, or the Anthropocene, depending on how you want to pronounce it. But it's basically a new geological age. It's a climatological marker. It's a historical marker that we are leaving the second world behind and we are entering a third world, or a third experience of planet Earth. And this is what it looks like if you think about it. So our civilization and our societies have building blocks. Food, water, ecosystems, our weather patterns, etc. are all part of the building blocks of our societies. And in this 11,000 year Eden that we've had, we've been able, if you like, to thrive and produce food to feed us and to meet our needs, to manage our water resources, etc. However, as we've polluted the world and as we've destroyed ecosystems and contributed carbon emissions, this is what's going to happen. And this is from the Stern Review in the UK. So if you look at food, just follow food. As the temperature increases from 1 degree to 2 degree, you see dramatic stresses in food systems across the world. Okay? Our own food system collapsed during the drought in South Africa. Now again, we really need to reflect on that. We need to take pause as a country. This food system is really not up to the task to deal with climate shocks, and there's going to be many more droughts to come. Okay? So it's in that context also that we have to think about systemic change and the new kinds of systems that we need to sustain life and to ensure justice. Okay? Similarly with water systems. Water systems are going to be very, very stressed. According to the UN, we'll only have 60% of the narrow base of water resources we have available in the next 20 years. I think it's an underestimation, actually. So, we are beginning to see extreme weather events as we enter this third world, or experience of planet Earth. And it is registering. Climate change is not just in the IPCC science anymore. It's in everyday life. And we can see it around us. We can see what a 1 degree increase in planetary temperature is doing to our world as we move away from this relatively stable Holocene climate. We are seeing massive typhoons in Asia. Philippines has been bombarded by major typhoons. And again, our media is not telling this narrative. It's not connecting the dots, with a few exceptions like Burning Planet, Daily Maverick. We've seen Cyclone Idai and Kenneth in Mozambique. Now this has been unprecedented in the context of weather patterns in southern Africa. One devastating cyclone after the other. This is new. There is a correlation with the shift in climate change. And the climate scientists I've been talking to at WITS, who have data for 30 years and so on, say yes, when you bring all of this into the perspective, you can see the connection with climate change. And we're going to have more of these extremes. The United States is not just having extreme blizzards. It's been having flooding, it's been having wildfires, etc., etc. Heat waves are hitting different parts of the world. Europe has just had one of its worst heat waves in the history of keeping weather records. So Paris was burning a few days ago. Germany as well, and so on. So extreme weather events have come with this 1 degree increase in planetary temperature. So the big question is, we've had these fluctuations in temperature and so on prior to 11,000 years. We then, if you like, had this moment in history, in geological history, 11,000 years, where we had a relatively stable climate and we were able to thrive as a species, but we are leaving that behind. We are leaving that behind and we're entering this world of climate chaos. Now, it's very, very important that we keep our eye on the science all the time, okay, in this conversation. And so one of the things that climate scientists are researching, are monitoring all the time, the canaries in the mine, if you like, are tipping points. And these tipping points will feed back into worsening climate change, and they will accelerate worsening climate change. So, if you look at the range of 1 degree to 3 degrees Celsius increase in planetary temperature, they have identified in yellow some very key tipping points, okay? And if these tipping points kick in, so the Arctic ice sheet, which emits permafrost, and ultimately, which has permafrost and emits methane, which is one of the deadliest greenhouse gases, that's going to feed into global warming in a big way, okay? So right now, the most recent sort of science around this is that scientists themselves are startled by what's going on in the Arctic and the Western Antarctic. So if you look at Antarctica, which is very close to us, we are the southernmost country on the African continent. We don't talk about Antarctica, but yet it should be part of our imagination, okay? It's close to us. Antarctica is, particularly West Antarctica, is melting at a rate that is confounding the scientists, okay? And this has a whole set of implications for sea level rise, for feedback loops into wider climate shifts, and so on and so on. So, we have this narrative of the Anthropocene, and human beings are a geological force. But from a climate justice perspective, we'll say it's not human beings as a geological force. It is carbon corporations. It is those that reproduce a carbon-based economy that are driving the shift into the Anthropocene, into the new geological age. They are, if you like, taking us beyond the stability of the Holocene. And at the same time, they are endangering the prospects of human and non-human life on planet Earth. The big question is, if these tipping points accelerate, will this be hardwired into planet Earth's ecosystem and climate system? In other words, will we be pushed into runaway global warming? This is the critical issue right now. Because if we do continue using fossil fuels and burning and behaving as business as usual, and we allow the big 100 carbon corporations to continue prolonging the use of fossil fuels, well, we are doomed, ladies and gentlemen. It's as simple as that. Okay? We will not survive what's coming. Okay? It'll take us back in time where human life could not survive. There will be unbearable conditions on planet Earth, essentially. Now, this is not alarmism. I've kept the science front and center, and this is what the scientists are telling us. And the problem is that we have a crisis of leadership around climate change. And from a climate justice perspective, we believe that there's another way to think through this problem, there's another way to confront this problem, and there's another way to solve this problem. From a climate justice perspective, and I've been pulling this through what I've been saying, we've got to understand beyond the physics and the science of climate change, we've got to find causality from the standpoint of the political economy. What are the social forces responsible for the climate crisis? Who are they? Because we can't pinpoint them. Okay? It's not all human beings. That's a false perspective. Okay? Saudi Aramco is the most powerful oil corporation in the world, and it's a private oil corporation. Okay? And we don't talk about it. It is one of the most dangerous voices in the UN climate negotiations, constantly pushing back the science on climate change. Okay? The United States right now has higher levels of carbon extraction than Russia and Saudi Arabia because of the fracking boom. And Trump is accelerating this madness. He's a climate denialist. He has sown doubt on the science. He's taken the world backwards, and so on. There's a rising mad right wing that echoes and ramifies his message, and so on. So you can see on a global context where the problem lies. We also know that if we reproduce the system, so if South Africa takes on fracking, offshore drilling and extraction, okay, and this is where the Kolobeni struggle is so signal and it is so important, because it's saying very powerfully to the powers that be, no, we don't want more mining. Okay? Now, do we want to extract the gas to 100 kilometers off Mossel Bay, for example, given the climate crisis, given the science of climate change? The other point about climate justice is that it's about the deep, just transition. The idea of the just transition comes from trade unions, by the way. Trade unions that have been thinking about the climate crisis for a long time and recognizing that they, workers in most of our economies, the precarious in our economies, the unemployed, are not going to carry the cost of the transition. They're saying that. That's what the just transition is all about. How do you ensure that the most vulnerable in our societies are not going to pay for this transition? We are living today in world history in a time where inequality is worse than what happened in the interwar years in the 20th century. And those conditions created the conditions for World War. And the rich have gotten richer in our societies, and they are continuing to amass wealth. This society in South Africa is unviable. By any metric, economic metric, this is not a viable country. You heard the latest data on unemployment, for example. You cannot, as a political scientist, I can tell you now, you cannot consolidate this democracy. It is impossible. It is impossible. A 19% unemployment rate in Argentina in 2001 brought down 4 governments. Our unemployment rate is actually at 40%, 60% for youth. This is not a viable country. Okay? So, the issue of the just transition is very, very important in the sense that we've got to tackle inequality and we've got to tackle the climate crisis. We also have to recognize from a climate justice perspective that as climate shocks kick in, with all these extreme weather events, who is going to be hit the hardest? And this is where we've got to bring a race, gender, and class lens to these things. In the context of South Africa's drought, the rich drop down boreholes in Cape Town. There are 26,000 boreholes in Cape Town. Okay? They're drawing water from one of the largest aquifers in Africa. But what happens to people in Kailicha, in Mitchell's Plain, and so on and so on? Okay? They have to carry the pain and the burden, and they've had day zero in their lives for a very long time. Okay? So there are racial, gendered, and class-based inequalities, and climate justice asks us and invites us to bring this perspective to bear on these moments. On the basis of existing inequality, climate inequalities, again, are going to tear our societies apart. They are going to unleash cleavages that are very, very dangerous. We've seen it through our food sovereignty campaigning. We had a drought speak out. We had a hunger tribunal with the Human Rights Commission. We had a bread march because bread prices and other basic goods went up during the drought. And the crisis is bad. And women are carrying the burden of this crisis in most households in South Africa. They are skipping meals. They are not eating food so that their families can eat, etc., etc. So climate justice forces us to think more deeply about this problem. It is also recognizing that we are not just talking about justice for human beings. We are also talking about justice for non-human life forms. We share this planet with other beautiful creatures, and they are integral to what is called a planetary ecosystem. So the indigenous peoples in the Andes has reminded us that we are actually living in a very delicate web of life, and we have to start thinking in terms of the rights of nature and so on. So climate justice is climate justice for all living beings and forms on planet Earth. It is also intergenerational justice. It's about justice for present generations, but also for future generations. Okay? And there's a danger sometimes in the climate discourse that we actually become misanthropic. We actually become anti-human. And this is the danger that I was alluding to. We blame humanity for this problem. Or human beings are messed up. Human beings are the problem. Well, I'm a humanist, and I refuse to surrender to that discourse. Okay? And so I really think that we have to be rigorous about this issue, about generational justice. And the young people that are marching on our planet, Fridays for Futures and others, are bringing this issue to the fore. Their future is ending. The window is closing very fast for them. And so we've got to resonate with this. We've got to take it seriously. Climate justice is also about building people's power. We will not solve this problem merely by event-based politics, merely by crowd-based politics, merely by lobbying government. That's not going to solve this problem. We need a dramatic shift, a societal shift, where we shift power from below in our society. So we're hoping with these dialogues, with these panels, etc., that we work towards a climate justice alliance. Now the roots of this climate justice alliance are in a 500-year history, if you like, from the Columbian moment, when Christopher Columbus bumps into Latin America, okay, where the genocidal violence that's unleashed on indigenous peoples through colonialism, okay, which doesn't stop there. It continues even in our own experience in the African context. And it's the destruction of species, it's the destruction of all kinds of life forms, and it's really based on a problematic understanding of nature. It's about the domination of nature, it's about the domination of indigenous peoples, it's the domination of others, and it's the domination of women. And this has been a struggle that people have taken up over 500 years. It's against a coloniality that brings a violence. And that struggle has continued in Standing Rock. It has continued in Bolivia against water corporations. It's continued in the Niger Delta in the 2000s, where women have stood up against Shell Corporation and so on. So this is a long struggle to defend life against a system that is anti-life. But it's also a struggle that has had a shorter history over the past 3 decades. And I've been alluding to some of these struggles. But struggles against anti-extractivism have been at the heart of climate justice politics. And it's been happening over the past 20 years in different parts of the world. Kolobeni, again, is a very powerful example of that, but there are many examples of this. Right now, in the Amazon, one of the most important biodiverse regions on planet Earth, indigenous people are being wiped out through genocidal violence by a fascist in power in Brazil. Bolsonaro wants to industrialize the Amazon, and he just is racist. He just doesn't care. Okay, he's a continuity of the Colombian project, basically. And if you wipe out the Amazon, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to wipe out one of the most important lungs on planet Earth, and it will accelerate climate change. It is one of the most diverse parts of our planet. So there are powerful struggles that have been happening. There are what I would call 1 degree Celsius movements that have emerged. 1 degree Celsius circa 2015, and these new movements are the Sunrise Movement, they are Greta Thunberg and the Children's Movement, they are Extinction Rebellion, etc. But they are part of a long history of climate justice politics. Climate justice has been around, as I've been saying, for a long, long time, and we want to reinvoke it and build it in South Africa. Very quickly to say that we are also dealing with a situation where the dominant project in the world has really brought us also to socio-ecological catastrophe by making the rich richer, okay? By constantly socializing the costs of the crisis, by constantly passing those costs onto society, we have created unviable societies, and I've used South Africa as that example. South Africa right now is entering another period of austerity to solve the looting problem, and that's going to throw up a whole set of social cleavages in this country. So you've also had a bit of a greening of, if you like, the dominant project, but this is based on various false solutions. It is based on carbon markets, for example. These are false solutions. But essentially, we are at a unique moment in world history. There have been various general or big crises of the system in the late 19th century, the interwar years, 1973, and today, from 2007, we are in a historically specific moment of crisis, of civilizational crisis. It's very different from the other big crises of capitalism. It brings together crisis tendencies that were not there before. It is not just financialized inequality and its instabilities. And the IMF does say we are going to have another collapse in the global financial system. They just don't know where, because this is the monster, the global casino they've unleashed on us. But you also have the convergence of the climate crisis, of the food crisis, of the water crisis. These are unprecedented crisis tendencies that are coming together now. And that is why it's a total crisis. It is a civilizational crisis. So in that context, we have to be thinking about the global transition. We have to be thinking about how do we, if you like, go to the heart of the problem. How do we decarbonize our civilization? Now the bad news is that despite the 20 years of science and IPCC negotiations, if you look at the global carbon mix that we have, actually it's continued for the past 2 decades. Coal is still very dominant in the global energy mix. There's been a slight shift towards gas, for example. So it's all about prolonging the use of fossil fuels. And the fossil fuel corporations have not been held to account in the multilateral negotiations. The UN has not passed an agreement that says fossil fuel corporations will stop extraction on this date. There's no such a thing in the UN negotiations. It's all about countries carrying the burden for this problem. So this is what it looks like on a world scale if you look at the global economy, if you look at it by sector by sector. So all these deadly gases, whether it's nitrous oxide, whether it's methane, whether it's carbon, comes from different parts of our global economy. And so again, this decarbonization challenge, we've got to start with those who extract carbon and sell it to us and keep the dependency and addiction going. But the struggle is bigger than that. To decarbonize South Africa, we're going to have a new food system. We're going to have a new transport system. We're going to have a new approach to building industry, etc., etc. It's a big problem. It's a complex problem. It's called a wicked problem, and so on. But again, there are climate justice solutions. We use a small amount of our fresh water on planet Earth, 0.5%, and it comes from these various sources. South Africa is a very, very interesting example. 62% of our water is allocated mainly to industrial farming. It controls and has a monopoly on the majority or the largest quantity of water resources in South Africa. It's on plus minus 5,000 dams. Now, we cannot go into a climate-driven South Africa with that situation. It is a recipe for racial conflict. So again, one of the solutions coming out of climate justice activism is how do we make water a public good? We have important water legislation that does that. But how do we build the water commons in South Africa so that the rich are not just using the borehole water, that water is shared with society and everybody has a right and access to that water? How do we protect the water commons? Our rivers, our dams, etc. are highly polluted. Our water source areas are highly compromised in South Africa. Again, we cannot go into a climate-driven world without some kind of democratic planning around our water resources. Our industrial food system is a nightmare. The International Panel on Biodiversity has basically said in the recent report, everybody in this room should look at it. It says we've actually, through industrial agriculture, destroyed our soils. And we probably have 60 years of farming left, okay, with the kind of chemicals and poisons and so on and contaminants we put into our soils. So we actually, this is that idea of the convergence of crises. The existing farming system, industrial, mono-based, has to go, okay? It has to die. There's various industries that have to go if we are to survive. So it's in this context that we are also talking about food sovereignty. So in short, we really have to start thinking also about the renewable energy challenge. And socially owned renewable energy is an idea that comes from trade unions. One of the pioneering thinkers about this has been the National Union of Metalworkers in South Africa. They've done research over the years. They've put this idea to government and government rejected it. Okay? And this is why you have such a standoff around Eskom, and this is why you have such a standoff around the REAP program right now. Because the workers have had ideas. They have had a perspective for a plan to go beyond Eskom. But this government has not listened, basically. So, we have a carbon criminal state, and this carbon criminal state is one of the highest carbon emitters in Africa. It has a carbon intensity more than China, India, and Brazil. It's among the 4/5 top polluters in the G20. Eskom kills about carbon pollution kills about 20,000 people a year in South Africa, according to the World Bank. Eskom kills about 3,000 people. There's a big contention around this in our courts right now. And of course, the way the government talks about the just transition, including in the National Development Plan, well, it's just transition plus fracking, plus it's offshore extraction of total. It's hypocrisy. Okay? This is not a just transition. This is not a just transition that will bring about systemic change. None of the parties in South Africa are serious about the climate crisis. We've looked at their manifestos. We put out a critique in April before the elections. It's farcical what's there. This is again the crisis of leadership. And this is why we've got to build a powerful climate justice movement. And this is why we've invited you here to this conversation, to this process. Essentially, the big debate is, what kind of nationally determined commitment do we want from South Africa? South Africa right now is leaning towards Germany's commitment to 2050 to be net zero. It's leaning towards the UK. South Africa, in terms of its carbon pollution, is a first world country. Okay, that's what it is. It's not a third world country. We are emitting carbon at a scale and a level of most of the top industrialized countries, and we've been doing it for almost a century. Okay, so South Africa has a very, very big responsibility, and that is why we have the Climate Justice Charter process, and that is why we want to, in this conversation, affirm the importance of systemic change. We're going to have to push forward these ideas, advance these ideas that have come from movements already. Kolobeni, No to Mining, the Metalworkers Union, socially owned renewable energy, food sovereignty campaigning, climate jobs, the rights of nature, etc., the basic income grant, and so on. There are powerful ideas, if you like, for the Climate Justice Charter, but we also want to hear from you. I'm going to conclude with this very short animation that we've been using in our campaign.
The food crisis is deepening. Why? Is this just unpredictable Mother Nature's doing, or are there other forces at play? The hidden story behind hunger, why we need food sovereignty and climate justice. In South Africa today, A fatal crisis is plaguing the land. Millions are suffering from it. Not only is it making survival difficult, it is ruining lives, destroying families, fragmenting communities, and crippling local economies. We're not talking about HIV/AIDS, or TB, or diabetes, or hypertension. We're talking about hunger. Hunger and its close relation, malnutrition. In a country that is abundant in resources, with great mineral wealth, modern cities, and fantastic tourism potential, over 50% of the nation's men, women, and children are food insecure. Who or what is to blame? Some blame it on the drought, some blame it on the El Nino climate cycle, some blame it on climate change. Some blame it on the government, some blame it on corruption, and some blame it on apartheid. These factors are all to blame, to be sure, but there is an elephant in the room. The truth is, we have been forced into an unsustainable, globalized, and coal-driven economic system that cannot feed and sustain the nation. The guardians of this corrupted system, a coal-driven minerals energy complex, and a rapacious cluster of globalized food corporations supported by the state, contribute directly to this country's climate, energy, and food crises. But South Africa is not alone in its food crisis. Globally, the loss of land, biodiversity, oceans, and forests is hitting the poor hard. How did this happen? Let's go back 200 years or so to the Industrial Revolution in Britain and Europe. Powered by new coal-fired technologies fueling their furnaces and factories, the capitalist economies of the global north spread their tentacles across the world. By the 20th century, 7 Western oil corporations controlled the global oil supply. Today, despite global warming, these corporations are still extracting oil through fracking, tar sands, deep-sea drilling, and a new scramble for Africa's oil. And here we are today, about 200 years later, in the post-colonial, post-apartheid, post-Fordist industrial age, bang in the middle of a planetary crisis. Capitalism is a key cause of deforestation, carbon emissions, and global warming, as corporations continue to pursue growth and profit above all else. For the last 20 or more years, the annual COP meetings of the UN have affirmed the interests of rich countries and corporations. Market solutions, techno-fixes, and voluntary commitments are not addressing the climate challenge. We need a new paradigm for a transformative, just transition. Let's think again about the web of life. Let's appreciate the interdependence we have with nature and build grassroots power for system change. Pioneered by La Via Campesina, the international small-scale farmer movement, food sovereignty is now an international campaign. Strengthened by international solidarity, the food sovereignty movement has the potential to challenge profit-driven food corporations and democratize the global food economy so we can adapt our food systems to climate change. Under the banner of SAFSI, an alliance of farmer groups, unions, organizations, and communities, we are fighting for a food sovereignty pathway and system. COPAC, like many others, supports the SAFSI and the solidarity economy. Together we can build a red-green alliance for a just transition now to sustain life.
Okay, so I don't know how you want to do this. You want to take a few comments? Or?
Yeah, if there are any comments or questions.